Welcome, everybody, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, December 12th, 2019. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. I'm representing a growing body of now more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition at AE 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we are all over the place, as you'll see. Last week, we presented part 1, World Trade Center Building 7. This is part 2, the Twin Towers Explosive Destruction, in which we will be examining the explosive evidence and the structural dynamics of how the Twin Towers collapse. Before we get into that, let me introduce you to our operations manager, Andy Steele. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. Just to let everyone know that I'm here to help with any technical glitches which do occur from time to time. And also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the course. You just submit them in the questions and information form online at ae911truth.org. I'll also be looking at Facebook comments and YouTube comments to see if any questions come up there as well. So you can submit them that way too. So with all that said, back to you, Richard.
And thank you so much. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. More recently, before launching full-time onto this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on these $400 million mixed-use projects in Las Vegas, in Summerlin, Nevada. 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproofed steel framing. More recently, though, before launching full-time on this important outreach effort, I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened, using the material in these courses to educate architects. So we're going to jump right into it today. The Twin Towers, how did they come down? Let's look at the design first. Some hailed it as I'll get you to the big slide here, as the crowning achievement of the international style. Oops. Yeah. And others faulted it as gigantic dumbness or heartless modernism, right? I mean, compare this to the elegant unfolding massing of the Empire State Building when it was first. Let's get over there first. When the Empire State Building was built, when the Twin Towers were built, the Empire State Building was the tallest building in the world at the time, with beautiful, unfolding, elegant massing, as you see. Oh, I know what we need to do. Let's jump over here, and that way you can see my smiling face. And this one. There we go. But it was the structural engineering of the Twin Towers that was actually quite innovative, no matter how you feel potentially about the actual design of it. And let's find that cursor again. There's got to be a better way. It just disappears on you sometimes. The passenger elevators for 50,000 occupants, getting them to efficiently to their place of work in 2 stages with these 3 different tiers of elevators. Altogether, almost 100 cabs in each of the towers. An extraordinary achievement. It's all about vertical transportation here. But the structure themselves, it was really quite an innovative concept here. Take a look. Before this, like in the Empire State Building, we had a forest of columns tying these structures together. Well, that was insufficient because it impeded the ability of the tenants to lay out their offices. What they did in the Twin Towers was push the outer columns out to the edge, and then half the columns they brought into the center. And these the outer columns were 3 vertical and 3 horizontal, welded in place at the factory and then bolted in place one at a time or several at a time. But the out of the field. But the core columns in the mid height were 16 inches by 22 inches with 2-inch thick. Between the core set of core columns, a massive set of 47 core columns, solid steel at the bottom, and thinning to 3/8 inch or thick at the top. This allowed a long span for these lightweight steel trusses, which were spanning between 60 feet on one side and 35 feet on the other side, creating an incredible opportunity for 3.8 million square feet of unimpeded cubicle, if you will, office space, mostly cubicles, as you see here. So this was quite unique at the time, but it had this open space, had limitations. The floor to ceiling height was insufficient for many. The columns marching every 3 feet 4 inches, these 14-inch square steel tube columns had to be covered with chipboard on the inside, aluminum cladding on the outside. It was more like a jail cell compared to modern steel frame high-rises, where they have these open, picturesque views of the cityscape below. And in the Twin Towers, we have, by the time 9/11 came around, as a matter of fact, they were requiring massive upgrades in communications, electrical, and heating systems, cooling systems. In network and so forth, and not to mention the asbestos abatement, which the city of New York was requiring the Port Authority to comply with the national laws requiring them to abate this asbestos. Altogether, we're talking about $15 billion in upgrades that were required, and yet the Twin Towers were acquired along with the other World Trade Center buildings by Larry Silverstein just 2 weeks prior to 9/11 with a $3.2 billion deal. So anyway, many find that interesting. We'll talk some more about Larry Silverstein later. But let's look at what happened that morning. And we have the official story being born here on the street.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes have flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience.
So when it was attacked again, he immediately...
Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust.
We ran to the building and went into the...
Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, fire, that caused collapse.
Well, in a nutshell, there's the official story, which we're going to be examining today. It starts like this. The North Tower was hit at 8:46 in the morning, of course. An hour and a half later or so, it collapses. It's not that the plane impact caused the destruction of the towers. In fact, NIST says that the most of the fuel burned up outside the building, 90% of it. The rest was gone in just 10 minutes. So we have office fires, essentially. The fuel just started the fires, is all it did. And it's basically kerosene, as you'll see. It's not some big magical, chemical bomb thing. So we have, in the case of the South Tower, it's hit about 30 stories down versus the North Tower, 15 stories down or so. And it collapses just an hour later. This is quite important for people to understand that it's the fires essentially that brought these buildings down, along with a few damaged columns. And so there were some investigations into these disasters. In 2001, some volunteers were handpicked to work from the American Society of Civil Engineers, which most engineers, structural engineers, belong to. And 2002, the FEMA report took over, and those volunteers worked themselves into the FEMA report, which had finally $600,000 worth of funding, very limited funding for an investigation of this scope. But their efforts were hampered by the New York Times, as the New York Times said they didn't have access to the site, they didn't have adequate access to the blueprints, they didn't have adequate access to the steel as it was being taken off the site. They were quite restricted, which is quite curious. And FEMA refused to let them appeal to the public. So we have NIST that took over the project in 2005 with $20 million in funding, and the stated goal that, or conclusion, that this building came down due to fire from the jet plane impacts. Their theory that these raging fires caused the floor trusses to sag in the area of the impact by the planes, and that sagging floor truss pulled in these exterior columns, apparently all at once, because the structure falls quite uniformly. The problem is, we'll get to other problems, but one key problem is here, the sagging floor trusses don't provide enough external force on a column. So they, in their computer model, forced the destruction of the columns by imposing an artificial 5,000-pound load on every column all the way around the building, forcing the building to fail. This is called fraud, we'll be getting at greater examples of just that. And there were no raging fires at the time of the collapse anyway. As you can see, thick black smoke indicating oxygen-starved and cooler fires at that time. So these are among the many reasons we at AE 911 Truth use the scientific method. We looked at it last week, a quick review. We have a question. How do the towers come down? We do some background research. How have other towers came down? We make some observations. We construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess. We lay out all the hypotheses without respect to our financial or political obligations that might sway our objective opinion. And those that are reasonable are explored. We make predictions based on those hypotheses, and we test those predictions with experiments, analyze the results, draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of our work. We don't hide, for instance, the computer input data that we showed that was hidden by NIST in our series, part 1 of this series last week with respect to Building 7. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, what do? We go back, construct a new hypothesis. That's what we're doing today until we have a hypothesis that is corroborated by the evidence. So let's do some background research. What are some of the forces that destroy buildings? Fire is certainly one of them, but before 9/11, it has not destroyed a high-rise building. But say in a wood frame building, what would we expect? It's an organic process. The fire burns out in any given area. That's in 20 or 30 minutes. That's all the fuel there is, even according to NIST, 20 or 30 minutes maximum. So let's say in a wood frame building, it'll cause the building to fall over to the path of least resistance, not straight down through the path of greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structure supporting that building, as if it weren't even there. They don't fall down that fast. And there's plenty of examples.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
So no collapse in high-rise buildings prior to 9/11 due to fires, and no collapse in many non-high-rise, non-fire protected buildings, such as this one here, where there's a sagging of the structure. Certainly, that's expected above 1200 degrees, at which point steel can lose half of its strength and begin to sag like this. Now, there have certainly been some collapses of non-fire protected buildings, like in factories. They're kind of sacrificial buildings, really. They don't even fireproof them because they have too much fuel load in many factories to even protect them against. Let's look at buildings that have collapsed due to natural causes. In this case, earthquakes. We have several examples. The building, if it's going to collapse, it's going to fall over to the path of least resistance. It's certainly going to be mangled. The columns and the beams are not separated one from the other. They're not severed, all of them. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder, as we see and will see today in the towers. Let's look at some buildings that were blown up. So we have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds with cauliflower shapes that are expanding rapidly due to the intense heat from the explosions, the chemical reactions of these explosives. We have witnesses that hear these explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have these features, you know you have explosions. That's important because explosions were not a part of the official story, and yet we have all these features, which we'll be looking at in some detail today. Now, explosions can be harnessed quite carefully, efficiently to take down high-rise buildings. It's called controlled demolition. There's only a handful of companies in the country that can actually accomplish this. It's quite a science. And it doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen by fire. What they do is place thousands of shaped cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building, and then set them off in a very careful order, usually starting at the bottom of the building and on up, like you see here, but not always. Usually the building comes down into its own footprint, but not always. Let's take a look at the features associated with controlled demolitions, because we have a sudden onset of the destruction, right? That makes sense. You're taking away the structure all at once, usually near the base of the structure. We have a straight down, symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint. Usually it's symmetrical because there's a patterned removal of these column supports, resulting in feature number 4, a free fall acceleration, straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structure in the building. And that can be near free fall also. It doesn't have to always be free fall. Feature number 5, the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame, right? That's what you want to do. You want to load it up piece by piece. So you're very careful about how you do that when you're bringing the building down. And so there's limited damage to adjacent structures as well, one of the goals of controlled demolition. Feature 7, you have patterned explosions heard by witnesses, flashes of light seen by them. If you have broken up concrete floors, that can be a telltale signature of controlled demolition. You don't have to go out and use jackhammers after you bring a building down to break up the floors at all different angles. It's very dangerous work. And feature number 9, explosive charges visible at many of these floors. These are isolated explosive ejections called squibs in the controlled demolition industry. And feature number 10, there's chemical evidence left behind in the residue. Hey, if you have these features, you know you have direct evidence of explosive destruction. Fire doesn't create any of these features, let alone all of them. So if you have all of them, you can be quite sure. Fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically, as we've already seen, with gradual deformation, following the path of least resistance. That makes sense. That's a more natural process. Well, no modern steel reinforced high-rises ever collapsed before 9/11. Why not? Well, one reason is the steel conducts that heat through it. It's a huge heat sink, basically. It distributes that heat away from the source, keeping the steel from ever getting to its 1200 degree Fahrenheit temperature, at which it can lose half of its strength and begin to sag. Also, we fireproof these steel beams so that that never becomes a problem. 2 and 3 hour fire protection, which is 6 to 8 times longer than it ever needs to be protected for, because the fire only lasts 20 to 30 minutes. So this gives the occupants plenty of time to get out of the building also. And we regulate what the buildings can be built out of and what tenants can bring in, mostly non-combustible materials. And to keep fire from ever becoming a problem, we also put fire sprinklers to save lives also. In the case of the Twin Towers, the fire sprinklers were said to have been damaged that system when the planes impacted the building. So there can be additional circumstantial corroborative evidence, such as governments documenting. You have to go and get approvals for a controlled demolition, typically. That can be very helpful. So people know also in advance. There's foreknowledge of the destruction, typically. Experts agree, hey, that's a controlled demolition. Well, at least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion. With video documentation, of course, this can all be proof of controlled demolition. And guess what? We're going to apply that body of proof to the Twin Towers evidence and see what we can come away with together today as we walk through the features of controlled demolition with respect to the Twin Towers. Was there a sudden onset of destruction? Well, let's look at the North Tower here. It's still it's been on fire for 90 minutes, and all of a sudden it is just going down, right? So no jolt, no hesitation, no impact. You might have on the internet seen hesitation, but trust me, go to YouTube and look at the videos with greater resolution. You'll see that it's a very smooth, sudden, and continuous drop. And we'll look at how fast that's going down. Looking at the South Tower, it's still as it's on fire, and all of a sudden, it suffers a smooth, sudden descent. Also, no jolt or impact when the moving structure collides with the intact, still cold, hard steel below. What's causing that? We'll come to that. Feature number 2. Is there patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses? Well, the fire commissioner, Thomas von Eschen, ordered all of his 500 first responders to be interviewed, and they were captured on tape. So we have the transcripts now of these only after the city was forced to release this material in August of 2005, when the New York Court State of Appeals forced them to release it to the New York Times. New York Times publishes it. What do they find? Right away, 118 firefighters observe flashes, sounds of explosions, and other phenomena indicative of explosive demolition. What? The NIST report included none of these pieces of evidence. Let's look at them, see if they're relevant. We felt the ground shake. You could see the tower sway, and then it just came down. Look at the order of these, the description of this phenomena that's being described by skilled first responders. First, they're seeing something or feeling something before the towers came down, or they're hearing something before the towers came down. Let's go on. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. Felt like a train running under my feet. The next thing we know, we look up and the tower is collapsing. Why is a train running under their feet before the tower is collapsing? It actually shook my bones shortly before the tower came down. I remember feeling the ground shaking, heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. An explosion appeared at the very top, simultaneously from all 4 sides. Materials shot out horizontally. And then there seemed to be a momentary delay before you could see the beginning of the collapse. There was an explosion in the South Tower, one floor under another. When it hit about the 5th floor, I figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. Seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings, seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt. All these explosions. None of these witnesses appear in the 20,000-page NIST report or their testimony. Let's look at the North Tower, see if it looks anything like a controlled demolition. What are these firefighters talking about? On the right, the North Tower. On the left, a known controlled demolition. Is there any similarity? Slowing it down halfway. Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper before 9/11. Explosions and demolition should have been the first hypothesis, if not the only one, but it was relegated to a series of frequently asked questions, very frequently, which came out years after the final report that NIST put out. You ever see professional demolition where they set charges on certain floors and you hear the pop, pop, pop? When I heard that friggin' noise, that's when I saw the building coming down. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially, it's just one flash. Then this flash just kept popping all the way around the building, and that building had started to explode. Saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. He saw about 6 of these brief flashes accompanied by a crackling sound before the tower collapsed. I saw low-level flashes. I saw flash, flash, flash. Then it looked like the building came down. The building was blowing out on all 4 sides. We actually heard the pops. You know, you heard the pops of the building. With each popping sound, initially an orange and then a red flash that came out of the building, and then it would just go all around the building on both sides. Let's look at the South Tower compared to a controlled demolition on the left, South Tower on the right. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was. A crackling explosive. Another loud boom at the upper floors. And then there was a series of smaller explosions which appeared to go completely around the building at the upper floors. And another loud earth-shattering blast with a large fireball which blew out more debris. The lower level of the building, you know, like when they demolish a building, that's what I thought I saw. You see any flashes? I said, yes. Well, I thought it was just me. He said, no, I saw them too. Everybody, I think, at that point still thought these things were blown up. So I was fully expecting anything else to blow up. You were there when the planes hit? No, I was there when the building exploded. You mean when it fell down? No, when it exploded. Let's look at these witnesses.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Is that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the
planet probably.
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went ba-boom, it was like a bomb went off. And another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, and there was a second explosion in the same building. There were 2 explosions.
Okay. Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
there was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there's secondary explosions and then subsequent collapses.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now, that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building. Is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That is
A huge explosion now raining debris on all of us. It sounded like gunfire, you know, bang, 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 bang. And then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
We heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
We heard a loud explosion, and at that point, Building 2 was collapsing.
At that point, we heard a large boom. I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion.
There was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down.
All of a sudden you hear explosion and you could see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
According to the Associated Press, another building that has either been attacked or exploded.
The tower, rather, that has collapsed, that we are told collapsed because of a third explosion.
And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. That's One World Trade Center, and part of the building collapsed.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the Second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions.
And then you heard from far away, boom, boom. And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
Floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was if they had detonated. If they were planning to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
From the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. And as the bombs were going, people just started running. And I sat there and watched a few of them explode. And it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go, like firecrackers.
Fascinating. Well, how many of these witnesses of explosions do you imagine appeared in the final report of the NIST or the draft report? None. Zero. Zilch. NIST says, well, it couldn't have been explosions, controlled demolition, because they start at the bottom. And this destruction started way up near the top. Well, let's listen to Mark Loiseau of Controlled Demolition, Inc. talk about where these can start from. And then we'll see a top-down controlled demolition.
Floor. You can go almost anywhere in the structure, and given the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, converting it into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
And there's your top-down controlled demolition. So NIST is wrong on that point. They're also wrong on this point. They say that the top portion of this building drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. Now, intuitively, that sounds ludicrous. And it's true. Newton's third law of motion says there's an equal and opposite destructive force when two bodies collide, like this, for instance. Who's going to win? Well, the Mack truck wins. A stronger, larger, more dense object will do the destruction. Does it matter if we drop the Volkswagen onto the Mack truck? No. The lightest part of a structure cannot possibly destroy the heavier, cold, hard, intact steel, particularly as it gets all the way down to the bottom. It's a virtual pyramid. Here's the columns at the top, only 3/8 inch thick. as you go down, they get thicker and thicker and thicker, as you see here, almost solid steel at the very base of the structure. 52 inches by 22 inches, these core columns, 47 of them. And now this theory of NISTs was actually put forth by Zdenek Bazant from Chicago Northwestern University in a 4-page paper that was submitted when? Just 2 days after 9/11. A very detailed, complex piece of scholarly work, which we're going to tear apart, called the crush down, crush up theory, where this body destroys the heavier, cold, hard, intact steel below. Problem is, this theory, once decoded by structural engineers who took the time to be able to understand where all the obfuscation was, the formulas are actually correct. The obfuscation is in the false input data. Let's look at it. 6 key errors. It's obfuscation. It's obfuscation. You can't critique it very easily at all. But those who did find that there's a whole vanishing story. In other words, you eliminate 282 columns on the story near the jet plane impacts, and then allow the top part to full 12 feet. So you get a dynamic impact going. Well, that's not how the structure was built. It's complete fraud. They doubled the mass up above. That's fraud. They decreased the column strength below. That's fraud by more than 3 times. And they also eliminated the column reserve strength. These are 3 times stronger than they need to be to hold this building up. So the end result is that you have the energy of the falling mass above was rendered nearly 4 times greater, quadrupling the impact load by the vanishing story. The energy absorption capacity of the column structure below is 3 times less. So the whole thing is rigged 12-1 in favor of a collapse. It is complete fraud. So what you have then, as we can see here, is the, oops, let's do it over here. We have the double line is the actual measured acceleration straight down over time. The Bazant theory is close to that in blue because they fudged their figures. In actuality, when you use the correct figures, what happens is the black line, as noted by David Chandler, it would arrest after 2 seconds all downward momentum because it would meet resistance below. So, oops, we've got this twice now. Oh, so these key errors are submitted to the American Society of Civil Engineering journals, but they refuse to publish them. After publishing a fraudulent paper by Bazant, the American Society of Civil Engineers won't publish the corrections to that paper, citing what? That it's out of scope. Well, how can it be out of scope to publish a paper citing the significant errors in the previous paper? Well, let's just actually look and see what happens in the video of the destruction of the upper part, because it is, like a Volkswagen, being destroyed. It's not driving down the rest of the building. Let me show it to you this way. Watch the red line at the bottom. It doesn't move down until more than half of the upper structure is destroyed. Interesting. So the question is, what's destroying it? Is it the downward movement, or is something else happening, as you can see by all of these explosive ejections, which we'll look at in more detail? Remember, the theory here is that the fire caused the floor trusses to sag, which pulled in the perimeter columns. Now, that theory is convenient because as we look at the video, this looped 5-second video we can see that the perimeter columns are being pulled in. They're inwardly bowing. The question is, what is causing that inward bowing? Well, let's start with FEMA's discovery before NIST took over that report.
When the collapse finally starts, the antenna started just a little bit before the exterior of the building started. And that tells us that the core columns let go first.
Fascinating. What they're saying, and what's proven here, comparing the antenna drop back to forward to, back to, forward to. You can see the antenna dropping yourself before there's any descent of the perimeter structure. Well, what does the antenna sit on? It sits on the hat truss. What does the hat truss sit on? It sits on these core columns. So the core columns must be failing first. That causes the hat truss to descend, and then the antenna sitting on top of it, as documented by FEMA. So what we're seeing here is something similar to this crude video where the core columns have been cut apparently down below, which we have been looking at evidence for explosions heard and seen by the first responders. Then that pulls on the trusses, and that's what pulls on the perimeter columns. So that's a far more coherent theory than what NIST is asking everyone to believe. The upper section is destroyed in the first 4 seconds. And this video is not happy. So let's see if we can bypass it. Come on. What you don't see is, in any of the photographs or videos, is the top portion of this building driving down the rest of the building. What you see instead is more like a waterfall of destruction, which we'll come back to. If there were a pile driver driving the rest of the building, you would not see these remaining 6 to 8 core columns which survived the initial destruction. They would have been crushed along with all the other columns, but they stand until they are disturbed by an explosion which shakes off the dust on them. So something else must have destroyed this building. Something that looks more like the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea, with upward, outward arching streamers, freely flying solid objects trailed by thick white smoke clouds, which we will come back to in part 3 of this series next week. But just looking at it doesn't even look like a gravitational collapse like you might expect. And let's look at the motion. This building, is it a symmetrical progression? Feature number 3 of controlled demolition. Well, this one's off center, right? So like controlled demolitions, they're not all straight down. But let's look at this in some detail, because we have the upper mass. There we go. Falling off of the body below at 22 degrees. It's off center from the axis of downward destruction by 22 degrees. So we have asymmetrical damage from this load, asymmetrical damage from the airplane impact damage to the columns above, and asymmetrical damage from the fires up above. How then do we get complete symmetrical destruction all the way down every face of the north and south towers? It makes no sense given what was going on. Let's zoom in to the lower corner of these explosions. Are we seeing a gravitational collapse, or are we seeing hundreds of explosions? I encourage you to look at this video on YouTube, because the internet seems to be showing it not as smoothly as I like. In the lower right corner of this video are the same sets of explosions, a little smoother in this case. 20 stories down below what we're told is a gravitational collapse. These explosions accelerating down the side of the building almost as fast as the freely falling debris. So we have a 1,200-foot diameter of destruction of this material, ejected laterally, destroying the winter gardens 600 feet away, as you can see where. Let's see. This is fascinating. Over here. So the steel frame is completely broken up, and the steel distributed outside the perimeter. Compare that to the nice, neat pile that is Building 7's destruction, a classic implosion, versus that we looked at last week, versus and which is available on YouTube in this series, by the way, versus the very explosive event, especially at World Trade Center 6, with a huge hole in the middle of it. By the way, if 100,000 tons of steel framing is distributed outside the footprint, I'd like to ask you a key question. What is crushing the building? Because that's not part of the crushing force. You say, well, maybe it was the concrete floors. Okay, we'll come back to that. Let's look at feature number 4 first. Are there ejections of building materials at the lower floors? Take a look at this looped video. Explosive industry. Come on. This video is going to want to play. Let's go back. Sometimes these videos act really fun. Back again, and then forward. They're occurring, these explosion if this was air pressure, they say, produced by that piston up above, that pile driver driving the rest of the building down to the ground. When we saw that pile driver was destroyed in the first 4 seconds of this building's demise. There's no pile driver, but even if there were, and it was pushing this air, if you will, down the elevator hoistway, and it'd come out somewhere, right? It would come out, the air pressure would become uniform, and it would blow out all the windows, if any of them, but not these highly focalized, pinpoint accurate, violent ejections occurring in often in an engineered pattern, as you see here. So no, it doesn't make sense according to the official story, especially in the case of the South Tower, where on the left you see over and over again dozens of squibs, explosive ejections on the left, coming out of the left side of this building in this looped video. And the whole inside of this building is being destroyed at once. These squibs are evaluated by physics teacher David Chandler.
Here, the ejection velocity of a squib on the east face of the south tower. At this angle, there is foreshortening, but the calibration distance is by the same proportion. Versus time.
150 miles per hour. These are explosive speeds. 160 to 200 feet per second, not air ejection. 50 meters per second. How fast is the building coming down itself? Feature number 5. Is it accelerating? Let's go back to, oh, come on. Oh, we went past it. Oh, misbehaving today. David Chandler looks at this in some detail. We'll go back one and then forward one.
We are here tracking the motion of the roofline at 0.2 second intervals through approximately 32 meters or 8 stories. This graph shows the height of the roofline as a function of time. The analysis is simpler if we plot velocity as a function of time. On this kind of a graph, a straight line indicates constant acceleration. First note that there is a sudden onset of collapse, as the point we are tracking makes a sudden transition from being at rest to an approximately constant downward acceleration. The slope of the graph indicates that the acceleration is 6.31 meters per second squared downward, which is 64% of free fall.
64% of free fall. In other words, the building is going faster and faster and faster each second, straight down through 100,000 tons of resistance, structural steel that's 3 to 5 times stronger than it needs to be to hold this building up, and it's not even slowing it down. There's more steel on the facade of this building than there is glass. Let's look at it another way. 7th grade physics, right? You take a block of building 15 stories tall. You hold it up with this giant crane over nothing but air. Another one held up over 80,000 tons of structural steel, 3 to 5 times stronger than it needs to be to hold that the rest of that load up above. We'll even give it the false dynamic impact by vanishing 12 feet of columns, 280 of them, so it can get a momentum. We're going to let them both go at once. Which one hits the ground first? Pretty obvious, right? Very intuitive. So this is basically telling us that they both hit the ground at the same time. In other words, a near free fall acceleration is quite natural. Nothing to look at here. Let's look at it another way with Massimo Mazzucco's New Pearl Harbor.
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. Alternatively, as shown in this experiment with 2 towers made of snow, the top section could have fallen off to the side after the initial collapse. What could not have happened is this.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it.
This is such a simple, fundamental concept that architects and engineers were astonished in seeing it totally ignored by NIST.
This is high school physics, and our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore.
But they do, of course, and that's why Tony Zamboni, Richard Johns, and others have submitted this paper, which did get published, not in the American Society of Civil Engineers publication, but in this other publication, and it made quite a stir. But the feature number 6, Do we have the total shattering of the structural steel frame? Well, the National Fire Protection Guide 921 for fire and explosion investigations, says look for what? Shrapnel effects. The complete shattering of the structural steel frame to the ground is what we see here. They say it's high order damage characterized by the shattering of the structure, producing small pulverized debris with the building completely demolished, debris thrown great distances. Look for that. That's what we have here. Completely individual segments, almost, with the massive shrapnel effects. The steel frame completely shattered, broken up, these columns into their 37.5-foot lengths. Do we have the lateral ejection of structural steel sections? Well, going back to National Fire Protection Guide 921, it says look for blast pressure wave effects also, with heavy structural steel pieces freely flying. As you see here, freely flying sections. It's not like a banana peeling. These are freely flying structural steel sections, independently caught on these different videos. And like this one heading toward Building 7 right here. Wait a minute. Let's go back to forward to. That's 45 degrees. That's a freely flying structural steel section trailed by thick white smoke clouds. Back to forward to. Structural steel is not flammable under conditions of normal office fires. We will look at what is the cause of these thick white trailing smoke clouds next week. Be sure to join us. So David Chandler takes a look at this lateral ejection.
Girders weighing several tons were found 600 feet from the base of the North Tower. How fast they were ejected depends on where they originated. If they came from high in the building, they were thrown outward at about 50 miles per hour. If they came from lower down, the speed had to be even greater. Gravity alone cannot account for such high lateral ejection speeds.
Well, what can? There is enough energy here to hurl a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. And there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. So there's a lot of unaccounted for energy here in the energy analysis equations. Feature 8, is there pyroclastic-like clouds of pulverized concrete? Well, where are the floors? We have 110 floors, each an acre in size. But we don't see them at the bottom. We only see a 2-3 story pile of miscellaneous steel. On the right, we see a pancaking collapse like what happened in an earthquake in Mexico. Where are the pancakes? The concrete is missing. Oh, here it is, pulverized in midair. 180,000 tons of concrete in both of the towers, pulverized to 100-micron particles, distributed across 3 square miles. 30% of this World Trade Center dust is concrete powder. Let's go to Governor Pataki.
And you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel.
What happened to the concrete?
The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust powder 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
You have 2 110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
What I expected to see was nothing like what I actually did see at the time of my arrival at the site. There wasn't much that you could say, you could describe. Everything was dust and metal. There was no typewriters, there was no chairs, there was no nothing.
Well, there were probably about 10,000 file cabinets that should have been found there, but we'll come to those. By the way, if 90,000 tons of concrete is pulverized and spread over 3 square miles, what's crushing the building? Wasn't the steel. That's outside the footprint too. The steel and the concrete is 2/3 the weight of this building. There's nothing left to crush. There's not much left to crush this building. I can assure you of that. Doesn't appear to be the file cabinets either, because they were pulverized apparently to a fine powder. This is the only one that they could find from an ice cream store in the basement. Maybe that's how it survived. Where did 10,000 steel file cabinets go? And what about the people?
In April 2006, New Yorkers were distressed to learn that bone fragments, human remains from 9/11, had been found on the roof of the nearby Deutsche Bank building.
And how, in God's name, did those fragments get there?
And bone fragments less than a centimeter long. How could they be so small?
Wait a minute. We have 700 bone fragments less than half an inch long found on the top of this building over here. Well, they didn't come from the people in the plane that hit the South Tower, because its ejections went out down this way. It didn't come from the people in the plane that hit the North Tower, because those ejections were blocked from reaching the Deutsche Bank building by World Trade Center 2. So they weren't from the people in the planes. Many of them were from firefighters, as we see by the tracking of these body parts. Firefighters found on the top of their bones, found on the top of the Deutsche Bank building. And of course, they weren't on the scene before when the planes hit. So it can't possibly be from that timing. So it wasn't from the people in the planes. We had 2,749 victims altogether at the World Trade Center, but only 300 whole bodies were found. Most of those, unfortunately, were jumpers. 20,000 pieces of bodies were found. 6,000 of them small enough to fit into a test tube. 200 pieces matched to a single person. And yet, 1,151 victims remain completely unaccounted for. That's 1/3 of these people were vaporized. How does that happen? And those parts that were found were distributed over 800 feet, many of them, beyond the perimeter of the towers. And how did that happen? Can this gravitational collapse cause this incredible degree of pulverization and distribution? Well, so far today, we've looked at 8 key characteristic and some very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition. Explosive destruction, we'll call it for right now. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Fires cause less robust structures to collapse. They do so asymmetrically, with gradual deformation, following the path of least resistance. Especially these fires would be incapable of doing that, which were thick smoke indicating oxygen-starved fires and diminished. at the time of the collapse. So how about the testimony of those responders? Well, since the 118, researcher Graham McQueen found there's actually 156 who were extremely specific about their testimony of explosions. And just as specific is the evidence that we find at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory 20 miles north, and which picked up seismic events near the time the planes hit, which the official narrative attributes those events to be due to the plane impacts. 0.9 magnitude in the case of the North Tower. Case of the South Tower, a 0.7 magnitude impact or event attributed to the impacts. Well, this is pretty interesting because Andre Rousseau, author of 50 peer-reviewed papers on progressive geo and mechanical waves, he says, well, gosh, sure looks to me like these seismic signals were received before the plane impacts. Let's look. For instance, hold on 1 second to increase the size of this. And all right. He says the plane hits at 8:46 and 26 seconds in the morning. That's when the seismic event happened. But the plane doesn't actually hit, according to the National Transportation Safety Board radar, which is accurate to within a second, which the 9/11 Commission relied upon for that accuracy. It doesn't hit until 14 seconds later, the plane. So we've got a huge discrepancy in the timing here. So NIST comes along and says, well, no, I looked at the videos and we think that it hit 10 seconds before. Well, wait, you're still quite far off from the NTSB radar. And you're still quite far off from the seismic event. So what do you do with that 4-second gap? Well, NIST actually goes back to Columbia University, which runs the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. They get them to move their data back 3 seconds. And they have a report that justifies that, but they will not release it to the public. What do you call that? Let's go to the plane impact at the South Tower, 9:02 and 54 seconds per the original LDEO data. The planes, according to the NTSB, don't hit for 17 seconds later. So how is this explained? NIST comes along and says, gosh, I'm going to shave 12 seconds off of that because we think the plane hit 12 seconds earlier. We watched the videos, and that's what we came up with. Man, 12 seconds off of the NTSB radar, which is accurate to within 1 second. They're still 5 seconds off. What do? In the same report, they get Columbia University to reevaluate and move this data back 3 seconds. Wow. With a report that we can't see. Well, what could be responsible if it weren't the planes for these seismic events? Let's look at evidence of explosions in the basement. Mike Procuro says the whole building seemed to shake and there was a loud explosion. They arrived at the sea level and found the machine shop gone, nothing there but rubble. We're talking about a 50-ton hydraulic press gone. They made their way to the parking structure. They found that it too was gone. A huge bomb had gone off in the basement. Well, this is corroborated by William Rodriguez and others with him in the basement. He was a janitor, and he says these explosions occurred before the plane. Hit. Come on, Willie. These videos are running slow today. We'll make sure we reboot this computer. Oops, let's go back and try again. You're going to want to hear this. Second chance. Talk to us, Willie. All right. He and two other witnesses are on video. And if you really are interested in seeing them, I encourage you to watch one of our last month's archive on YouTube with the same title as this month's archive. You can search for it. 9/11, An Architect's Guide, Part 2. As we go on and say, well, gosh, what is Andre Rousseau? Again, author of 50 published papers on progressive mechanical waves in geology. 2012. The frequency of these waves were on the order of 1 hertz. In other words, the impacts would have been only 1 hertz. But aircraft crash, excuse me, I got it backwards. The waves that LDEO found were on the order of 1 hertz, but aircraft crash impacts are above 10 hertz and often up to 100 hertz. They know this. I mean, this is previous history. It's data that you could rely on. And those frequencies were filtered out by the bandpass filters because they don't want to measure everything that happens, only earthquakes and explosions, things like that. Rousseau says the range of the instruments doesn't even allow for the recording of aircraft impacts. The seismic equipment is designed to detect seismic events around 1 hertz. Interesting. Okay. He says the actual waves generated by the crash even had to have been deadened before hitting the ground, much less picked up by Lamont Doherty at that frequency. All right, let's go to the seismic waves that were detected around the time of the actual collapse of the building. Because this is interesting. We have, they say it's due to the debris from the building collapse hitting the ground. Okay, interesting. Let's look more detail at this. Because the surface waves occur at 10, 28, and 31. So that's the event. The tower starts descending 9 seconds before that, and the first debris, which is the lightest debris, hit right around that time, about a second, it starts hitting the ground. But the heaviest debris, which NIST is saying this is, doesn't even occur for 4 seconds later. So what does NIST do? Well, in the same report, for the third time, they get Columbia University to move this data back in a report that they do not disclose. Again, what do you call that? What could cause these waves? Well, if you look, there's some very well-defined P waves, primary, and S waves, shear waves, that occur before the big Raleigh waves that we see to the right. And these were ignored, interestingly, by others, but they're certainly picked up by Professor Andre Rousseau from France. Let's look at what happens 4 seconds earlier, though. Well, explosions. Actually, 6 and 10 seconds earlier, which is consistent with the first responders that we already heard from. But is there additional support for that? Yes, there are cameras on tripods that were watching the towers because this was a huge international event. And what you're going to see here is right there, a big shake, and 6 seconds later, the North Tower coming down. So, coincidence? Did somebody kick the camera? Unlikely, given that's exactly what is, if we go back, that's exactly what could have caused those P and S waves, as you see there, according to Andre Rousseau, scientist. So we have another camera on another tripod mounted on the top of a high-rise, which shakes 10 seconds before the collapse. Coincidentally, and whoops, this video is having trouble too. Let's go. Be patient. It will go. Yes, we will reboot this computer. Waited long enough, going back, forward, and forward. Play for us. No, back, and come on. Just wants to be black for us. Okay, fine. Again, interested in that one, watch last month's video, part 2 of this 3-part series. So that's, let's look at the first collapse, the South Tower, because the start of the seismic event occurs at 9:59 and 04, but the start of the tower, the seismic event occurs 5 seconds after the start of the tower's collapse. And again, the first debris doesn't even hit the ground until 7 seconds later. So what's NIST to do? For the 4th time in the same report that we can't see, they encourage Columbia University somehow to move their event back 3 seconds again, which more closely coincides with their theory that it's the debris striking the ground. But there is another explanation for this theory, not to mention the dozens and dozens of first responders who heard explosions, felt a train running underneath their feet before the tower came down. Well, 3 seconds before the start of the tower's collapse, in fact, there's another camera on a tripod looking at the North Tower. And so that is hopefully going to play for us here. That one's going to go black for us too. We're having a great day today. Okay, so you can watch that one. I think that occurs, well, I forget how many seconds before. So the official narrative says that this is due to debris hitting the ground, but let's look at it another way. The concrete floors were pulverized to dust and distributed outside the footprint of the building. So there's no seismic component from the floors. The steel frame is distributed 600 feet in every direction in 4 to 8 ton structural steel sections, some of them a little more than that. So they don't hit all at once. They're peppering the ground, and it's not even the ground. It's the top of the basement structure, which is coupled to the ground through columns, but it's basically a drum that it's hitting. So these seismic components are negligible, and they're equally distributed over the superblock. But even more interestingly, we have 2 separate events produced by videos, which are not going to play for us either. Identical collapses of identical buildings producing an extremely different energy of 1.6. So what we're told is that the collapse of these buildings caused these events, but the events are so different from one another, unlike the buildings and their collapses, which are the same to each other. The logarithmic scale of seismic numbers here, it's 1.6 times greater energy in the North Tower than the South. So it can't be. It simply can't be the towers. Identical buildings and identical collapses can't possibly produce seismic events of extremely different energy releases, according to Andre Rousseau. All of this evidence, the seismic evidence, is summarized quite nicely on the Consensus 9/11 project, the best evidence panel at Consensus 9. Oh dear, I don't have the URL here for you, but Google consensus 9/11. We'll get you the URL up here next month because that's important. Anyway, their point, Twin Towers 7. Why did the Twin Towers collapse? The seismic evidence summarizes quite nicely this evidence. Some have suggested that, gosh, you're comparing. They thought that there should be a much greater seismic component when the towers did hit, because here you have a 2.3 magnitude earthquake from a 6 or 7 story building. Well, this is a 25,000 ton concrete roof, which hits the ground almost all at once. So, not true. You can't compare that. I mean, the structure, as we talked about with the Twin Towers, it's concrete pulverized to a fine powder, and the steel pelted the ground over time, over 15 seconds of time. That's not true. Ends up being about 9 seconds of time from the first impact to the last. Anyway, Andre Rousseau has this paper that really goes into quite a bit of detail in here. Were explosives the source of the seismic signal emitted? Also, Graham McQueen, with these camera shakes, he documents this very carefully. Did the earth shake before the South Tower hit the ground? And seismic proof from Craig Furlong and Gordon Ross back in 2006, also quite good. So what about the data from the FEMA and the NIST reports? That could be quite helpful. We have, after all, 20,000 pages, $20 million effort by NIST. They were tasked by Congress to determine how and why World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed, and how World Trade Center 7 collapsed, which we looked at last week. But they had their own objective, and it was hidden in a footnote 13 on page 82. Our focus was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse. Wait a minute. Initiation. It doesn't actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached. Wait a minute. Stop everything. You were tasked to explain how and why World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed, not how the initiation happened. You had 10,000 pages in this report, and there's only 1/2 of a page on the events following the initiation of collapse. Let's look at it. The structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance. The large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure to absorb it. Came down essentially in free fall. Actually admitting free fall here. The floors below were unable to arrest the moving mass. Wait a minute. This is not an analysis with supporting calculations. It's pure speculation. Structural engineers do this for a living, calculate the ability of the structure below to support the structure above. Even the resistance to an impacting mass is not rocket science. This is a pre-collapse report. Should have been called the final report on the initiation of collapse. It's a travesty. So we submitted a request for correction, which you can do under the Data Quality Act with agencies who produce fraudulent results like this in their papers. And they write back, we were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse of the Twin Towers. And similar responses to other questions and challenges that we posed to them. They said years later in an FAQ, we found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. But a year later than that, when pressed, they finally admit, we didn't test for the presence of explosive residue. You can't test what you won't, you can't find what you won't test for. What about the experts? Like 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition at AE 9/11 Truth demanding a new investigation. William Rice, for one. The prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the twin towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself, crushing all 287 massive, there's the right number, 287 massive core columns on each floor while maintaining a near free fall acceleration, as if the 80,000 or more tons of supporting structural steel framework underneath didn't even exist. David Scott, structural engineer. Near free fall collapse violates laws of physics. Scott Granger, fire protection engineer. All three collapses were very uniform in nature. Natural collapses, due to unplanned events, are not uniform. Van Romero, director of the Energetic Materials Research and Testing Center at Tech, New Mexico Tech. Explosive devices caused the collapse of both towers. It's too methodical to be a chance result of airplanes colliding with structures. After the airplanes hit the World Trade Center, there were some explosive devices inside the buildings that caused the towers to collapse. Now, he retracted all of this, perhaps favoring the federal contracts that this university receives abundantly for their studies on explosions. That's speculation. How about Mathis Levy, who before he joined the FEMA team said this: great. Well, he's seen it looks like a controlled demolition. That's what he says. You can see that in last month's video. And Ron Hamburger, who was a structural engineer who helped with the FEMA team. But before that, he said, it appeared to me that charges had been placed in the building. Upon learning that no bombs had been detonated, I was very surprised. Where did he learn that no bombs had been detonated? You've been seeing evidence of detonated bombs for the last 2 hours. Well, hour and a half. Mike Taylor, Executive Director, National Association of Demolition Contractors. The collapse of the World Trade Center towers look like a classic controlled demolition, mirrored the strategy used by demolition experts. In controlled demolition, explosives are placed not just on the lowest 3 floors, but also on several consecutive floors, about a third of the way up the building, cascaded down like an implosion. Andre Rousseau, again, physics expert, geophysics expert. Even if the plane impacts and the fall of the debris from the towers on the ground could have generated seismic waves, their magnitude would have been insufficient to be recorded 34 kilometers away. That's 20 miles. Should have been very similar in the two cases to one another, but they were not. Controlled demolition is confirmed and demonstrated. What about the evidence? Surely, in the worst structural failures in modern history, we have the preservation of the evidence so engineers could investigate and do analysis and forensic inspections. But here's what happens, according to this forensic engineer, Abolhaz Anastani Azel from Berkeley, UC professor. Oh, of course, he's not going to be playing either, but here's what he says. All the evidence of the steel went to the melting pot, to China, for recycling. Now, that was within 2 weeks after 9/11, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out, crucial evidence that can answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. And easily the 3 largest and most perplexing structural failures in history, 400 truckloads a day, were removed from the site again, starting just 2 weeks after 9/11. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene. What have we shown with regard today to the scientific method? Have we shown the hypothesis confirmed of jet planes and fires, according to the official story, or explosions and controlled demolition? You get to decide. And we hope you'll let us know in your comments, because we believe that what we've shown here is 8 very key characteristic features and some very uncharacteristic features too, again. That's direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them, with additional circumstantial and corroborative testimony and eyewitness testimony. And we believe that's proof of controlled demolition. With that in mind, I want to turn it over to you guys and let me know if there's questions. Let Andy know. And Andy, when you tell them how to submit their questions.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, please submit your questions that you might have in the same input form we talked about before. That's online, ae911truth.org, or I'm more likely to see it there. You can also try to put them on Facebook and YouTube comments. If I see them, I'll ask them. In the meantime, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved. If now that you're informed, you agree that this evidence is quite compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Well, great. This is fantastic. Let's encourage everybody to get informed. There's lots that you can do. Sign the petition at AE911Truth. Join 3,000 architects and engineers. Support them. There's 20,000 others signed on to our petition. Be one of them, demanding a truly independent investigation. And that occurs all right here on our website, where you can also support us with your donation. Again, we're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Your donation is tax deductible. We have 6 staff, and we are all over the place trying to keep up and push the envelope to get action in Congress, action in the media, action with the academic institutions. And also you can volunteer and support us that way. How many ways are there to volunteer, Andy?
There's a number of ways, and we always come up with new ones. Sometimes our volunteers come up with them, but it's just a little bit of work each week because everybody chips in and we get major projects done that way through those efforts. And so it depends on what kind of personality you have. We have work for you to do if you're just the type of person that likes to stay at home and work in front of a computer, or if you like to reach out and call people, well, there's work for you to do there too. And we have translation teams, we have verifications teams, so you can help out if you're willing to put forth the effort. And the first step is to go to ae911truth.org. You fill out a very short application form. We'll get in touch with you and see how we can put you to work.
Fantastic. And there's things you can do on your own. Also, elected representatives column, television, radio, newspaper. We've been doing this for 13 years now at AE911Truth. We've got all the materials you need on our website and in our store. Most of it's free for you to do your job. We're doing ours. We're asking everybody else to join us in doing your job. Tell everyone you know. Screen the DVDs. Give out the brochures that we have available on our store. Tell everybody about the World Trade Center 7 evaluation, which we looked at last week in part 1 of this series, where the University of Alaska has now completed its 4-year, $300,000 study, which you funded, our donors, so hundreds of them, which concludes that the NIST theory of fire bringing Building 7 down, the 3rd skyscraper that collapsed on 9/11, is absolutely ludicrous. It came down only because 650 columns were removed all at once. That's the conclusion there, and that's why we go to Congress with the Bobby McIlvaine Act. What is that, Andy?
that is hopefully what all of this is leading to. We've asked for a new investigation for a number of years, and now here it is. We've done most of the work for Congress for it. And it's called the Bobby McIlvaine Act, as you see there. It's named after Bobby McIlvaine. He was killed by an explosion as he was entering the North Tower lobby that morning. And of course, that doesn't really jive with the official story. So right there by the name of the act, you have it being put into question. And it's a great conversation starter for people approaching their members of Congress. And what it would do is it would create a select panel. It can be passed in either house of Congress. And it would do exactly what we've been looking for them to do for years. It would look into the collapse or destruction of these three towers for real and look into the possibility that explosives were used. But this can't happen unless we have the help of our supporters. So we have a webpage where you can get active on this. You go to ae911truth.org and actually /justice. That's important. And there's a form on there. You just put in your address, and by your zip code, they'll be able to figure out, the full computer will, who your representatives are, and generate a letter to them. That's the simplest thing you can do. On your own, you can go to town hall meetings, ask questions. You can call your congressman's office. It takes only 2 minutes. I've done it many times on many issues, including this one. And let them know, because they don't do anything unless they have a lot of pressure from their constituents. So ask them to get behind the Bobby McIlvaine Act. If they ask you what it is, another great conversation starter. You can talk to them about the evidence. We got a guy who's approaching presidential candidates every time they go near him in Iowa right now. And he's gotten to every single person that's running on the Democrats' side. I think only Trump is running on the Republican side. It's pretty hard to get to him, but he can get to everybody else. And he's even talked to Joe Biden and Tulsi Gabbard and Bernie Sanders. I mean, all of them. And there's a lot. So you can do that too. Let them know that you're out there and that you want this act passed.
Awesome. And thanks, Andy, so much. You guys can join us by getting that info to your congressperson, as Andy mentioned. You can also, what can you do about this? I mean, we've got a promise from the U.S. attorney to turn our evidence over to a special grand jury. That's historic. And we're suing the U.S. attorney to prove that this is underway. We've also sued the FBI for withholding information from Congress, which they had of ours, our video on the subject, the nanothermite paper as well. They've written back saying, yeah, we got this stuff, but they didn't give it to Congress in 2015 in the 9/11 Review Commission, which they were obligated legally to do. That's a problem. And one of those major pieces of evidence is this documentary, 9/11 Explosive Evidence, Experts Speak Out. We've assembled 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence. I want to give you just a taste of a couple of minutes here and encourage you to do something with this landmark documentary. Great. You're going to hear it, but you're not going to see it. All right. Go to YouTube, type in 9/11 Explosive Evidence, Experts Speak Out, and it comes up. So we've got about 1 million views of this on YouTube. It's free on YouTube, the 90-minute version, and the 2-hour version, along with Meet the Experts, the extended interviews with all these experts. It's extraordinary. You can get that in our store. You can also get the 50-page booklet, Beyond Misinformation, which just pulls the rug out from NIST. So we've got so many ways for you to do your job. Like show them the 2-hour video presentation, which includes Building 7 and the Twin Towers. That's also on YouTube, by the way. And the 15-minute video just on Building 7, made for PBS. And it is extraordinary, narrated by Ed Asner. It's free on YouTube. You can also get the DVD. With that in mind, let's jump to the questions, Andy.
And I got police. I have police cars going by and behind me. I don't know if you guys hear it. That's not coming from me, so don't worry. All right. First question asks: are the seismic events that occur before collapse initiation in both twin towers evidence that there were explosions below in the basement levels?
Wait, let's take that one at a time.
Sure.
Because because this is actually complex. I see it on my screen here. It's a great question. The seismic evidence proves that there were explosions somewhere in downtown New York. And it proves that they occurred before the planes hit the towers. As we talked about, the NTSB radar is accurate within a second. So NIST is clearly lying when they say they're relying on videos. So we know, but we don't know where in the towers by the seismic evidence those explosions were. We have to rely on other witnesses, which I couldn't even play for you today because the videos weren't playing, which will not happen again because we're going to, I have an idea how to fix that permanently now. It came to me. So we're going to rely on witnesses of explosions in the basements, which you can see again on part 2 of this series from last month. Okay, Andy, what's the rest of that one?
Okay. The next part of the question says the explosive evidence during the collapse are positively revealed by the squib. So I'm trying to understand why any pre-collapse explosions in the basement levels would be necessary just prior to collapse if there are already explosives rigged throughout the towers triggered in an order of top down.
Right. This is a great question because I wouldn't think that they would set explosives in the basement as a pre-weakening of the steel columns, because you would risk the building coming down. I mean, the explosive array starts at the point of jet plane impacts and works its way down. There's no reason in my mind to pre-weaken the structure down below. You can do that fine when you get down there. So I and many others think that the explosions in the basement were designed to sabotage the fire sprinklers. This is speculation because they wanted this whole event to be blamed on the fires following the plane impacts. And if those fires were put out by the fire sprinklers, they wouldn't have that excuse. That's my theory anyway. Do you have anything to add to that one, Andy? Maybe your own theory.
I think that's good speculation. It doesn't change the fact that it was there, that the evidence shows it. So my best case scenario for getting to the truth of that would be to get the perpetrators in front of us and lay out exactly why it was done.
Yeah.
And have them explain it to us. But it doesn't change the eyewitness testimony of William Rodriguez, and it doesn't change the seismic evidence. It was there and it shouldn't be. The next question asks, if NIST claims their studies were based on sound science but have to withhold some of that science from the public, then what prevents others from discovering the withheld information if they also know how to investigate using the same sound science?
Well, NIST had exclusive rights apparently to the data and chose not to reveal, for instance, the computer input data for the Building 7 computer analysis. How do we get that from them? We are, in fact, suing them under the Freedom of Information Act for that information. That takes years, unfortunately. Others can find other evidence, as we have. For instance, the transcripts of the first responders' testimony of explosions have been out there since 2005. So others can find this evidence in this arena, as well as other arenas of forensic evidence, as we have, and as we will disclose the forensic evidence of extreme heat next week in this three-part series. There's plenty of evidence out there that's damning to the official story, and it could put a lot of people away. The key is getting it into the hands of an uncorrupt judicial system, legislative system, and executive branch of the U.S. government. And the likelihood of that, given our success or lack thereof over 13 years, is extraordinary, absent a catalyzing and catastrophic event that is helpful to the 9/11 truth movement. So a groundswell, in other words, of public outrage, which should have happened the immediately following, but the censoring by the media, 90% of which is owned by 6 corporations, who are in turn controlled by the arms industry, the oil industry, the banking industry, the insurance industry. There's lots of reasons we're not getting truth. And so how do we get a groundswell, a public groundswell of outrage when the public is relatively uninformed, even though 20% of the people know about this evidence? How do we get them to do more about it? That remains an open question, which we have to wrestle with.
Okay, our next question asks, Zdeněk Bazant bases North Tower pile driver theory on having 2 floors worth of columns being removed suddenly and symmetrically to initiate his free fall that he calculated in his paper. Isn't that only more likely from explosives more than from fire weakened steel?
Yeah. So in the computer model, this lofty structural scholar removes 12 feet of columns, 287 of them, all at once, and then starts his computer calculation with the top part falling 12 feet onto the bottom part, and the rest is rigged, as we discussed, increasing the mass above by like 3 times, decreasing the capability of the strength below by like 4 times, rigging the collapse 12-1. Yes, the only way to remove 287 columns at once is with explosives. And we have filed an ethics complaint against the American Society of Civil Engineers to rectify the refusal of them to publish the correction and the challenge to this peer-reviewed paper in another peer-reviewed paper. So we expect results on that soon. And yeah, explosives. Anything else to add to that one, Andy?
No, I think you covered it. A lot of dishonest stuff going on there, of course, in these analyses. And of course, that analysis just mentioned came out within a few days of 9/11 happening, or at least was the theory was put out there. So it's pretty quick to figure out what happened after the event took place. Last question today says, how did NIST explain the perimeter columns being pulled in suddenly if the cause was said to be a gradual heating of floor trusses?
Well, their theory is that the fires from the jet plane impact somehow an hour and a half later, in the case of the North Tower, even though those fires moved on and diminished, anyway, they say they were raging at the time of the collapse. And so they caused the floor trusses to sag, and that pulled in the perimeter columns. So it's a nice theory, but I mean, on the surface of it, until you look and see that sagging floor trusses don't have the 5,000-pound load necessary to buckle those columns, especially all of them, and not all at once either. In the computer model, NIST buckled them all at once, even though fire, as you know, is a very organic process, and it was even diminished at the time of the collapse. So the question is a really good one. You can't expect NIST theory to be carried out practically. It's the same with Building 7. They have a theory that can't possibly explain the videos and the evidence of this collapse. But they put it in a 10,000-page document that is so obfuscated that most structural engineers don't even look at it. You need a multi-million-dollar piece of software and computers to even try to check NIST's work. And yet they won't release their computer data, so you can't. So that's how you bamboozle the public and the profession, building professionals. Other thoughts on that one, Andy?
I have nothing to add to what you said, but the idea just came to me. We get a lot of good questions like this week after week, and I don't know if they're all coming from the same person or same group of people, or if it's just different people coming in because it's all anonymous when it comes into me. But this, my challenge to the audience is when you send these questions to us, send them also to NIST. Send them in and get an answer from them and send that back to us, because we'll give you our answer, but I think NIST will be even more interesting to you and to us. And I'd like to see what they have to say to some of this as well. So please do that.
Great idea.
So that's it for my part in this. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and I'll see you next week. Richard?
Yeah. In fact, today we were looking at the Twin Towers overview, explosions, sudden near free fall collapses, high velocity, lateral ejections, the shattering of the structural steel frame, midair pulverization of concrete, all those witnesses of explosions that don't appear. Now, next week, we're going to be looking into the extreme heat, which is not produced by these high-rise fires, as you can imagine. Pyroclastic light clouds, molten steel and iron, molten iron microspheres, and the evidence which produces it, which is thermite and nanothermite. So join us when we come back a week from today at 1 p.m. Pacific. And then in January, we start all over again, the first Thursday in January, 1 o'clock Pacific. Part 1, the third skyscraper that collapsed on 9/11, World Trade Center Building 7. Until then, Andy and I would like to thank you for joining us, and we'll see you back then. We'll get all our videos working just fine. That's a promise. Bye for now.